and a new system will come into place from March 2018. I think what is extraordinary, well, let me just say what they've done, and this is a good initiative, long overdue. There's a bit of Donald Trump here, because Donald Trump today is going to sign an executive order about hire Australia, hire Americans, buy Americans. Really good stuff. And there's a bit of that here in this announcement, and Peter Dutton, who has done a tremendous job, the minister responsible, I'll talk to him later, but his hand is all over this. Basically, a couple of things that would impress you, I'm sure. The next scheme will be a lot stricter. There'll be 2 new temporary, that's the key word, because you see, what happened under the old scheme, you get a 457 visa, then you get permanent residency, then you get citizenship, then there's a secondary visa attached to the 457 where you bring the family in. So that becomes then an immigration issue, then it becomes a housing issue, then it becomes an employment issue, then it becomes a welfare issue, then it becomes a rort. And it's been going on for some time, and I have to say it prospered under the previous Labor government. Who was the minister? Bill Shorten. Come to that in a minute. Turkey. This Erdogan says his plans to assume sweeping new powers don't make him a dictator. Out in the playground, they'd call that bull manure. He's told CNN a constitutional reform package passed by a narrow majority of voters is not about him. That is absolute rubbish. This bloke is the next Kim Jong. Erdogan, a dictator in every sense of the word, and a supporter of Islamic State. And he's trashed Turkish democracy. The memory of Ataturk is buried. I am immortal, really, he says. I could die at any time. Yeah, when you've got all this power, you can say what you like. The proposed changes represent a transformation in the democratic history of Turkey. There's nothing democratic about this at all. The bloke has taken all power. There'll be no prime minister. He can appoint judges. He can control the budget. He can appoint the judiciary, the magistrate, the police, the whole deal. And he said, where dictatorships exist, you don't have to have a presidential system. Here we have a ballot box. The democracy gets its power from the people. It's what we call national will. What you've heard me say about that bloke, I think he's an absolute grub, Erdogan. It's unbelievable, this bloke in Turkey. Another listener has written to me about that as well and said, with Erdogan's sweeping new powers, we can expect the next election in Turkey in 2019 to be a true and glorious exercise of 1987 Robert Mugabe-style democracy. One man, one vote, only one man standing. No one else got a chance. That's the world. Now, to what extent is our Christianity under siege? Weekend before last, Egyptian Coptic Christians were bombed by Islamic State in Alexandria. I've been there, beautiful place, and the Nile Delta. It was one of the groups in Syria that Assad has been fighting against, the mob who did the bombing. Now, as we know, the Easter weekend commemorates the passion and the crucifixion and the resurrection of Jesus Christ. It's a reminder of the blessing we have, as I said in the Easter program on Friday, living in a nation that derives its key moral values and legal systems from a Judeo-Christian tradition. One of those traditions is that the individual is separate from the state. And salvation can't be achieved by taking over government by force. We don't stand for that stuff. You don't have to like the laws, but you accept them, or you run for Parliament to change them. That's our system. The Judeo-Christian tradition honours each person. You're an end in yourself. You're someone. You're not a servant of the state. The individual is the prime centre of that kind of value system. Neither the state nor the church owns you. But the starting assumption of Islamic State and communist states like China and North Korea is the opposite. The state has the call on your allegiance, on the legal entitlements that you have. This is why people make Australia home. Our economy can generate wealth. The economy isn't legally determined by somebody else, whereas this Erdogan's going to be in charge of the budget and everything else. Islamic State run everything. The oil, the banks, the lot. Citizens here can get on with their life, hopefully without being harassed, although that's increasingly coming into question. But at the end of the day, is Christianity under siege? We ought to be thankful. We ought to be thankful we're not a Christian living in an Islamic territory. We tolerate this stuff here. They don't. Palm Sunday. Egyptian Coptic Christians bombed. Is Christianity under siege? Does anyone care? Berg writes, Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, your country needs you now. Yeah, with that Erdogan, Turkey will be the next North Korea. Gas producers will front the Prime Minister today to update him, that's what we're told, on how they are fulfilling their March commitment to supply more gas to the domestic market. Reports last week suggested they'll try and change the subject, and rather than brief Malcolm Turnbull on what they've done, they will instead argue there is no gas crisis. Unbelievable, given AGL's warning that it was, quote, out of contracted gas last month. I'm sorry, you can't believe these people. They're about one thing, bottom line and export money. Believe it, couldn't give a stuff about what you're paying for your gas or for your electricity. The Australian Industry Group, which is the amalgam of employers, says the government must apply a national interest test to gas exporters. Hello? I've only been saying that for about 10 years. The AIG says the government can impose restrictions on the gas industry by applying a national interest test outlined in the Export Control Act of 1982. Well, I don't even think you need to go that far. Of course the government can impose restrictions, and they do that in the granting of licences. When they give out a licence for exploration, they simply say, well, OK, you can have a licence to explore at X, Y and Z, but 25% of the gas that turns up comes back to us, and it'll be sold here on the local market. Pretty easy. That's the term of the licence. You don't need to have a national interest test according to some act of Parliament. Anyway, they're advocating a swap arrangement, and you don't need this either, but this is what they're advocating, under which gas exporters would release more local gas for domestic use and then purchase cheap gas on the Asian market to make up any shortfall in their export contracts. You see, the export contract, this is the, don't start me. This is the centre of the corrupt process. In Queensland, the Bligh government issued contracts to these people before they even put a shovel in the ground. So they got an export contract for X million litres of gas, and then suddenly are saying, oh, well, you know, we can't meet the export contract if you're going to have a gas reservation policy and take some of this back from us. Well, tough stuff. So they can't make up the shortfall. Now, currently, gas exporters are buying gas from outfits which would otherwise supply the domestic market and using it to bulk up their export quota. Well, the licence was improperly issued in the first place by the Labor government in Queensland in particular. We have plenty of gas. Our reserves from existing mines would meet domestic needs for 184 years. But it's all going into the export market. So Japanese manufacturers and Japanese homes are paying less for Australian gas than we pay for our own stuff. Now, the Australian Industry Group, this is the amalgam of employers, are saying, well, we can have a swap policy. We don't need a swap policy. We simply need a national gas reservation policy. You can extract the gas. If you're an international conglomerate, fine. But a quotient of what you extract will stay here for us. How hard the Dutch electorate went to the polls on March 15. There's an enormous amount of international tension, or there was, focused on whether Geert Wilders' Freedom Party could really shake up Dutch politics. Wilders is part of a wave of politicians in Europe who are not only anti-Islam and anti-immigration, but explicitly anti-EU. And he promised to lead his country out of the EU. He just failed to make the grade in terms of numbers. Well, Theresa May now is facing the Brexit challenge. The Labor Party are in disarray. She's in front by, well, some say 21% at the polls. But, as I said earlier, will people who voted to remain in the EU vote for a Labor Party that's in disarray with a stack of unelectable policies? Then we've got France, and they'll go to the polls in the first round on Sunday. All eyes on Marine Le Pen. The Le Pen family has hovered over French politics for decades, but things have changed. And two things give her an advantage. The first is that she's got rid of her father, and that he had a range of wild policies, expelled him from the party. But the second advantage comes from events. Europe is reeling from two separate crises. the 2007-2008 financial crisis, and then this immigration crisis as well. And both play into Le Pen's hands. Then there's Germany, due to go to the polls on September 24, and Angela Merkel with a frightening mistake in welcoming waves of immigrants that suddenly have promoted violence and a reaction against the government. Well, Frank Furedi is a sociologist, a professor, a commentator, an author, a former professor of sociology, as I said, at the University of Kent. He's written extensively about all this, and what he has to say is instructive for us. He's written significantly, too, on freedom of speech, arguing that throughout history, human progress has been dependent on the freedom to express what we, or some might call, some dangerous ideas, or might be seen as offensive. But as he rightly says, what's offensive to one person might be just the expression of someone else's opinion. He's highlighted the fact that since the triumph of the Leave campaign in Britain, Brexit has become a symbol of defiance throughout the continent. And it's at work here. As Tony Abbott and I talked on TV last night about the issue that at the last general election here, 40% of the electorate failed to vote for either Turnbull or Shorten. 40%. If that's not a revolt, what is? But as Frank Furedi says, the so-called populist revolt didn't begin with Brexit. He said one of the most remarkable events, and unremarked, in European politics occurred a couple of months ago, before the Brexit vote, and it was the April 2016 referendum in the Netherlands that rejected closer European Union links to Ukraine. And he makes the point that the Netherlands is one of those liberal nations in Europe, but 64% of voters rejected a political trade and defence treaty that had already been signed by their government and approved by all other European Union nations. And as he said, what was remarkable about the Dutch referendum was that it occurred at all. And this is the key point. The referendum was triggered by an internet petition launched by young Eurosceptic activists, and it gained more than 400,000 signatures. They weren't interested in Ukraine. They just used the referendum as a pretext to kick the Dutch establishment in the face and to teach the Brussels, the EU bureaucracy, a lesson. And as Frank Furedi wrote, a group of law students in Amsterdam told him last May, we're not going to play their game. We want out of the EU. Italy are going the same way. There's a 5-star movement there. Young people, idealistic, looking for a new way of doing politics. And I might add, Mark Latham has just set up a website here, and so far he's got 500,000 people reading what Mark Latham has to say. He's going to be a regular guest on this program as from next week. But Frank Furedi says the 5-star movement is led by a clown, Beppe Grillo, but the threat it represents to Italy's traditional holders of power is not a joke. He alludes to last November's referendum in Italy, where they defeated a constitutional reform proposal advocated by the former Prime Minister, Matteo Renzi. They defeated the referendum. The Prime Minister's gone. This is all happening, and we see it here in Australia, where governments run out of ideas. Tony Abbott's in the headlines every day only because we're in an ideas vacuum. Now, part of a good initiative by the 457 on the 457 issue today, and it's commanding attention. Tony Abbott's on page 15. But there's very little of this stuff. And Abbott keeps pushing out ideas because he's that kind. Well, now we've got Turkey, where this amazing referendum has given Erdogan unlimited power. He's going to be the Robert Mugabe of Turkey. Complete power over the budget, complete power to dismiss ministers and judges and dissolve parliament. We've got Mugabe in Turkey, Kim Jong-il in Turkey. So what's happening? Well, recently the Washington-based Pew Research Center found that Islam will be the largest religion in the world by 2070. That Islam is growing faster than the global population. It found the population of people describing themselves as Muslim will grow by 73% between 2010 and 2050, compared with 35% for Christians. By contrast, the world's population is predicted to grow by only 37% by 2050, the Muslim population by 73%. Well, where does Christianity stand in all this? This bloke who's Erdogan, who's now got all power in Turkey, is a supporter of Islamic State. This report found Islam has the youngest following amongst major religions, a median age of 23, 7 years younger than non-Muslims. That means a larger share of Muslims are at an age where they'll begin to have children. And Muslims have more children than members of other religious groups. A cultural war is about to break out if it hasn't already broken out. Best described by a story from Fox News America last year, which said in relation to Turkey, if today's Western leaders possess one general trait, it is a genius for self-deception. Insisting that Islamist terror has nothing to do with Islam, or that religion has no strategic impact, or that all human beings want freedom and democracy, all human beings, amounts to declaring that up is down, right is left, and night is day. If today's Western leaders possess one general trait, it's a genius for self-deception. Well, Professor Frank Faridi's on the line, sociologist, author. Great to talk to you. Thank you for your time. Where are we heading?
Well, it's very difficult to say, but the interesting thing is that the world as we've known it is changing very, very fast. And as you were indicating earlier on, a lot of ordinary people are not prepared to put up with the old establishment. They're questioning the values that is promoted by the dominant institutions. And I think these are very exciting times. The old Cold War has finished. The old establishment has been found wanting and is unraveling. Throughout Europe, all the mainstream political parties are discovering that they have very little support. Young people no longer join them. It's become really a party of geriatrics. So I think everything is up for grabs. So in that sense, the world ahead is quite exciting.
So you've been around. The thing about you and your writing is that you've moved around. You're not sitting behind a desk and you've talked to people. And I read a piece that you wrote recently when you said, I'm struck by the number of times I'm told, this is a France I don't recognise, and I wish there was a party I could believe in. That's exactly what Australians are saying.
Yes, well, I think it's interesting that you do get that reaction, especially if you make a bit of an effort and you talk to people in bars and pubs on the street. I go to football quite a lot, and I talk to people in the stands, see what they think. And you find that their hopes and the aspirations that they express very rarely get voiced on television or in the newspapers. And what they're really saying is that they're basically looking for somebody or a party or a movement to which they could attach themselves. So they're looking for a new focus for their loyalty.
Yes. See, Corey Bernardi has here broken away from the Liberal Party. He's a man of wonderful integrity, and he's called it Australian Conservatives. And he says Australians are sick and tired of accommodating a minority religion while undermining Christian traditions and heritage. And he argues that Western values and Australian cultural traditions are being undermined. I mean, that's exactly how people in the pubs and the clubs feel.
Well, I think what they feel is that their values and the legacy of the past, of their parents, of their grandparents, has got very little recognition at the moment. And it's not that they necessarily hate anybody or they dislike anybody. They basically want to feel that their views are taken seriously and that their community actually matters.
That's right. See, we have a citizenship ceremony where we have a pledge. From this time forward, I pledge my loyalty to Australia and its people, whose democratic beliefs I share, whose rights and liberties I respect, and whose laws I will uphold and obey. But no one enforces any of this, and people say what that Frenchman said to you, what's happening to my country? How do we answer that question?
Yeah, it seems to me that the pledge you just read out sounds really good, and I think it's just important that that's given real meaning and content, because in a sense what a lot of people are saying is we need to have something that binds us together. We just can't simply carry on leading our segmented parallel lives. Just saying that, we live in a diverse society and that's the end of the matter. So you need to have some way in which people can say, this is what it means to be French, this is what it means to be English, this is what it means to be Dutch. And Australian. I think that's really one of the main challenges that we face as a community.
What it means to be Australian. See, what I love about your writing, I can tell from it, and I read a lot of stuff that you've written, that you've actually got out from behind the desk, because you wrote something in a recent piece that I'm getting every day here when I talk to people, and you said there's this mood of cultural uncertainty, And you made the point that the political class in Europe here are constantly telling us, quote, we live in a globalised world. This is what the politicians say. And you say that devalues the meaning of home and community and nation. So national sovereignty has re-emerged, hasn't it, as a big issue?
I think it's the major issue of our time because, whether you like it or not, people need to find a framework within which they can get meaning from their lives. And it seems to me that the only area within which that meaning can begin is within a nation. It's not possible to be a global citizen and that actually having any relevance for your life. And the very attempt to devalue national sovereignty and to say, well, we need international institutions, we need to live in a globalized world, basically, in a sense, alienates and estranges people from their own community and has a very destructive impact. And I do think that taking the national sovereignty serious is really, really important. And in particular, I think it's important that we question this assumption. It's often promoted that any kind of national sensibility is by definition xenophobic, is by definition racist, is by definition violent. It fails to realize that people's identification with their national culture is not a zero-sum game. Just because you love Australia doesn't mean you hate New Zealand, doesn't mean you hate Indonesia. It simply means that that's what you identify with.
Good on you. It's great to talk to you, Professor, and thank you for your time.
Pleasure.
There is Professor Frank Faridy. What about that? He's struck by the number of times him told, this is France, I don't recognise it. I wish there was a party I could believe in. People are coming back to this Turkey thing, and we've got to be careful. There's a movement here. This bloke now is a dictator. He's denied it. Erdogan has taken his campaign outside of Turkey, remember? He wanted Turks living outside of Turkey. Think how this applies to us, who are eligible to vote in the referendum. More than 63% of Germany's Turkish population voted yes to give this bloke power. They don't live there. Half of these people were eligible to vote. In Sunday's referendum, 3 million German residents with Turkish roots, half of them eligible to vote. Well, the German daily newspaper Bild ran the headline, German population with Turkish roots helps Erdogan win. Germany's not the Lone Ranger. 80% of Turks living in Belgium, 72% of those living in Austria, 70% of those living in the Netherlands, 63% of those in Germany voted yes. What's that say about the capacity of largely Muslim Turks who've chosen to leave their country of origin and live in the West? Happening here, do you think? To embrace Western values? What? And they're supporting Erdogan? Is the West, including Australia, surrendering core values, this is what I talked to the professor about, and threatening democracy via out-of-control immigration policies? Sunday's referendum in Turkey was about abandoning parliamentary democracy in favour of creating a Mugabe in Turkey, a new constitution. Will abolish the Prime Minister's office, give the President control of the budget, the power to appoint and dismiss ministers and judges, the power to dissolve Parliament. And a greater proportion of expatriate Turks, Turks living out of Turkey, voted in support of the changes than those who have to live with them. Question: how many immigrants here are not loyal to Australia? Forget the pledge of citizenship. And are we going to allow this to continue without identifying it and doing something about it? Smart text message to me from Jim, who makes this very valid point. Muslims moving to the West but maintaining and adhering to Erdogan-style powers and philosophy constitutes a demographic jihad, a numbers game. They're playing a long game of demography over democracy. And that's the strategy, and it's been the same for 1,500 years. And they're coming here, fill the place up, and bit by bit, whether it's Christianity or the democratic process or who's running government, this is what's happening. And, of course, remember, this notion of believing it's not is an exercise in delusion. We've got government leaders who aren't prepared to mention it. We had a Royal Commission into Child Sexual Abuse, but the Muslim community weren't investigated, not Islam schools. So there's a problem. There we are in Turkey. They move to the West. but they voted for Erdogan to have extraordinary powers. We'll keep talking about it, even if no one else will. The next governor of Jakarta takes place today. One of the two candidates, as you know, is the current Jakarta governor known as Ahok, ethnically Chinese and a Christian. He's not only standing for re-election, he's also on trial over an allegedly blasphemous comment he made on September 27 last year. His political opponents were quoting a Quranic verse implying Muslims should not choose non-Muslims as their leaders. Don't say this is not an issue. I tell you what, get serious. This is what it's about. So Muslims should not choose non-Muslims as their leaders as a reason not to vote for Ahok, a Chinese Christian. Ahok argued his rivals were misusing the verse to deceive voters. Unbelievably, that harmless comment sparked violent protests. One protester was killed, and the Indonesian President Widodo was forced to postpone a visit to Australia. Ahok was subsequently charged with blasphemy and could be jailed for 5 years if convicted. By all accounts, this bloke has been an outstanding governor who's cracked down on corruption. Indonesia's biggest Islamic organisation, an outfit called NU, has come out in support of Ahok. But hardline Islamists say they will defy police orders and deploy tens of thousands of what they describe as guards to polling booths across Jakarta today. The government will deploy 60,000 security personnel to try and keep order. Ahok is up against rival candidate Anies Baswedan, an Islamic scholar and former education minister. If Ahok wins, it will represent a massive triumph for sanity and common sense over Islamic religious extremism in Indonesia. But don't hold your breath. That's happening today, and it's a measure of the time. Disgrace that we're getting into a lather about giving $900 million to an Indian outfit to build a rail line from their mine to their port so that they can export our coal to their country and make a phenomenal profit, and they're billionaires, and we're talking about giving them $1 billion, and here are people at Oki struggling when the Prime Minister promised he'd look into buying back their land so that they could get out of these contaminated areas. We've heard from the Lismore people this morning. It'll be there forever and ever on this clean-up. Businesses who've got no business, people who've got no homes, and if you've got no home and no business, how do you pay the mortgage? Has someone called in the banks? That would be the first thing I would do as Prime Minister. I'd call the banks in and say, I wouldn't be aggressive with them. Now listen, we want some sympathetic understanding here. These people, give me a commitment what you're going to do. How are we going to get the names of these people and these businesses? This is not the time to be terrorising them about repaying every month. They don't have a job. They don't have a business. That's what you do. Has the Prime Minister called the banks in? Has anyone spoken to the banks? No. I mean, what are our priorities? I don't know. I have got no idea. And Tony Abbott will only occupy the media while there is an intellectual and ideas vacuum in the government. Now, today, Tony Abbott's on page 15. Why? Because the government's done a very good thing on 457. Dutton, brilliant. Turnbull articulated it well. Excellent. Where's Tony Abbott? Page 15. Because the government is seen to have done something. Tony Abbott occupies the headlines because to the public he's talking sense, he's talking simply, and he's talking persuasively. And people know that he's got something to say and something to offer. Well, if there's no one in government that can do that, they should move on and let someone into that space who can. Where human beings come second to sharks is rubbish. There's room for both. If you want to swim in the ocean, that's fine. Put the shark nets out. And why haven't we got them? Why don't we have shark nets and tell the people that's where the sharks go and this is where we go? It's a pretty simple piece of technology. It's cheap. It's economical. It can be done. Why isn't it done?